Well, I just think that leads on to the kind of question which you didn't ask, which was the question around complacency. And so we don't end on a somber note. I mean, you argue in the book that complacency increases the danger of incremental erosion. And so how do you think political parties and civil society organizations can combat those autocratic tendencies, the backsliding that's occurring, the identity politics, which is resulting in that politics of fear and so forth? I mean, it seems to me that one of the kind of challenges of your book is how to reactivate a civil society that is active, engaged, participator in, wants to make sure that the things we value most are protected.
Well, let me make two comments, and Kevin, I'll just admit at the outset that I'm veering a little bit away from your question, because how publics respond to this is obviously, most people are not interested in politics, and it's not what structures their day. And so there has to be a touch point where people feel that something has gone wrong and they want to see it addressed. And they don't necessarily think in terms of democracy. But I'll just say two things, one reiterating a point of Bob's, and another, which maybe will get us a little beyond the issues of the United States and the narrow issues of the United States. But the first point is, we spend a lot of time as political science looking at political institutions, but actually surprisingly little time looking at governance, at the effectiveness of government. Yeah. And we get caught up in procedural issues, the electoral system, how Congress works, how parliaments work, and so forth. But what happens on the delivery of public goods is something which is quite consequential. And that's not just a question of legislating, it's about the efficiency of the delivering of services. And I think one of Bob's points is that those are things that matter to publics. And if you want to reach publics, then one thing is to shift the agenda back to problems that people actually have: healthcare, risk, education, jobs, those kinds of issues. But then what I'm going to say next, it might seem contradictory, but I think in the wake of these episodes where the system has held, it's really important to think about a reform agenda of the political system itself. And there are very interesting books now being written. For example, Jack Goldsmith at Harvard has a book called After Trump, which is a 350-page book about how to reform the presidency in the United States and undertake, incremental changes that will limit the damage if you were to get another character like him. And this is something I think every political system that's been afflicted with this disease, if we can call it that, if it comes out, needs to re-examine quite fundamental institutions and think about reforms that are going to prevent this from happening again. And I'm sorry to say in the United States that H.R. 1, which is trying to address these issues with respect to the integrity of the electoral system, has gotten sidetracked by other priorities. But this is an example of an effort, not all of which I agree with that bill, by the way, but as an example of the kind of work that has to be done to guarantee that these things don't happen again.
And it's true that I think everywhere elections rise and fall on personal issues. It's a matter of the price of gas and the price of food and the availability of jobs and all of that, healthcare, et cetera. And people vote self-interest. That's what it boils down to. And when you have voting rights being suppressed at the same time all over this country now, and all the things that certain states are trying to do to prevent voting, it makes hearing from voices even more difficult, because we're not supposed to be around anymore in the electoral process. And here they are pushing. So it's a pretty critical time in this country, and I think all over the world, as we think about this rise and what it implies. And what it implies now in the middle of climate crisis and pandemic and the great need for institutional international organizations that can cooperate, and how that falls apart under these authoritarians. So
Or do you want to make any comment about complacency and governance? I mean, one of the things which occurred to me when you were talking then, actually, Steph, was the sort of whole notion of, that question about effective governance raises issues around political capacity to solve the problems that are confronting the world, and the effectiveness of institutions to deliver it, and then overall the kind of the wider question of legitimacy. Bob, do you want to make any
Well,
comment?
look, I think that the first challenge of governability is to figure out what is important to people, and which is not very easy to do, actually, because there's lots of things that are important to people, and some of which are doable and legitimate, and others which may not be. So the first sort of challenge, or one challenge, is to figure out what governments can do that will really meet, can identify felt needs and then can really meet them. And although I think that the main problem that we're facing in the United States is from an authoritarian party that is appealing to the worst instincts of the American public, which is true. I mean, we've been talking on the United States, but it's true generally in these cases. But a large part of that means, in turn, that a large part of the challenge goes to the Democratic parties, small d Democratic parties, that can focus on realistically on issues that don't divide, but that people generally want. And it's, Paula, you mentioned important things: healthcare, education, job opportunities, upward mobility, degree of old age security. All of these things, I think, are things that people want. And so the challenge to the small d Democratic forces is to really zero in on issues like that, that can unite rather than divide, or at least have the potential for uniting rather than dividing. And then hoping that A, people respond to that, and B, that governments can deliver on those things.
I want to add one non-tangible to your list, which is the issue of respect and dignity, which I've learned both in this country and all over the world is fundamental for people, and often a cause of violent conflict. So it goes in the hopper with all the other human needs that we have to meet.
On the basis of your analysis and the conversation we just had, what do you think of the prospects for the democratic project over the course of the 21st century, as all of the kind of problems that are on the table get compounded and all sorts of other issues materialize that were unanticipated? Are you basically hopeful Democrats, or are you on the side of pessimism?
I'm a worried Democrat.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'm either pessimistic or hopeful. I'm worried. I don't think the game is lost here in the United States or elsewhere. I think democracy has very important things to offer, and that these become more salient and more important when democracy is taken away from people. So wouldn't count the system, that type of system, out in any of the backsliding countries that we've looked at. But they're in a big hole, and it's going to take time and be very challenging to dig out of that hole.
I guess I would take the answer to my answer to your question as somewhat different but complementary direction, which is to come back actually to the international dimension of this, which we haven't talked about that much. But I think it's a time when the democracies really need to support one another in a whole variety of ways. That we need to support each other in terms of technologies that can help identify potential threats, in terms of expanding prosperity, addressing global public goods, again, not for airy reasons, but for very pragmatic reasons and essentially continuing to improve the lives of their citizens and addressing the common problems they face. And I don't say that through as UN speak or happy talk. I mean it as an imperative that the democracies are not going to be able to do this on their own individually, because they're operating in a context which is increasingly hostile on a number of fronts. So this is cooperation not as a dream, but as a necessity if these questions of democratic governance are going to be addressed.
It's also a nice response to the hope question. I mean, there is a place where hope lies, and that's one of them, and that's worthwhile.
All right, we could have continued this conversation for a very long time, and I just want to thank you both, Stephan and Bob, both for your lifetime's research dedicated to these issues, but also for the humanitarian dedication you both demonstrated to a world in which these institutions are not to be dallied with, not to be played with, but are absolutely critical to our well-being as we move into the 21st century. So thanks for being excellent humanists, thanks for being wonderful scholars, and thanks for your contribution to this conversation.